So thanks again, Samo, for the time and effort you made and the invitation you accepted for this talk. I don't even call it an interview. It's a very friendly atmosphere with you. I hope we can both enjoy it. Okay, so I have some introductory notes about you. Samo Tomšič studied philosophy at University of Ljubljana, Slovenia, where you completed his PhD in 2008. His research areas comprise political philosophy, structuralism, critical theory, epistemology, and theoretical psychoanalysis. Before moving to Germany, he worked at the Scientific Research Center of Slovenian Academy of Sciences and Arts. I suppose you are now busy in Hamburg, right? Teaching there?
Yes, right. At the University of Fine Arts.
Right. And you have numerous publications. Among them are Jacques Lacan, Between Psychoanalysis and Politics, The Capital is Unconscious, Marx and Lacan, and The Labor of Enjoyment Towards a Critique of Libidinal Economy, which we are going to talk about today. So my first question, Samo, is quite unphilosophical. Where does this triad of Freud, Marx, Hegel in Slovenia come from?
I don't know. I think it imposed itself. It has a bit of a history, of course, and it didn't fall out of the sky. You know, if you ask, for instance, Slavoj Žižek, he will tell you that the late 60s and throughout the 70s was for him and also for his other colleagues a phase of sort of experimentation with different theoretical settings. Žižek himself, you know, was initially very much into Derrida, Heidegger, and then moved on to more Althusserian setting and more classical structuralism, and then sometime in the late 70s ended up, you know, with this combination of Lacanian psychoanalysis and Hegelian philosophy. I think this was the main the main orientation. Of course, they were all always reading Marx and Critique of Political Economy, but of course through these Hegelo-Lacanian lenses. So it's been around in Slovenia since the late 70s, I would say, and it's been developing.
And this atmosphere is still present there, right?
Sorry?
This atmosphere is still present there.
Yes, it's still present, and there are, you know, always new people coming in. The circle is expanding, and I mean, it's been developing in diverse directions in the 90s and 2000s up to the present. So, you know, it's not that everyone is, you know, strictly following the line that Žižek has been pursuing, you know. And also, if you look at Žižek's and Alenka Zupančič's and Mladen Dolar's take, I mean, they are forming sort of organic unity, but they still have different priorities, let's say, and are not, you know, entirely, you know, speaking the same thing, even though they are fundamentally sharing the same theoretical orientation.
And can I say that your priority is like theoretical psychoanalysis?
Well, I mean, I think everyone's priority, well, not everyone's priority in Ljubljana. Like I said, there are people, you know, who are working more on aesthetics and, you know, going more into a Badiousian or Rancierian direction, or, you know, even just not really working specifically on this Marx, Lacan, Hegel nexus. But this idea of philosophical importance of psychoanalysis is shared by many, and also, yeah, the term theoretical psychoanalysis, might be disputed by some, and it's kind of echoes theoretical physics. Also, at least in my mind, these two terms are sort of connected, that theoretical psychoanalysis relates to clinical psychoanalysis, perhaps, in a similar manner as theoretical physics does to experimental physics. But without wanting to pursue, this homology too far, I mean, I would, of course, immediately also admit that you can't really compare physics and psychoanalysis, because in psychoanalysis, nevertheless, clinics and theory are articulated in a different manner. You do not approach the clinical field with theoretical models, and then it either fits or it doesn't. But spontaneous, I would say, the articulation is much more complex, and questioning the very pertinence of the division between theory and clinics,
right,
or theory and experience,
right.
But at the same time, and this is also one important feature that us philosophers have to adopt from psychoanalysis, is that clinics is a field of objective fictions. Not only objective fictions, material fictions. That's also the point of Lacan's slogan, the unconscious is structured like a language. So, it's structured, it's an order, it has its logical laws. It's, pertaining to what Lacan calls the symbolic order, but at the same time, it's a phenomenon of the speaking body. So the accent is really on the corporeality and on all the disruptions, disequilibriums, dysfunctionings that language, this objective fiction, generates in the living body that speaks, and that is spoken by language, by the activity of speech.
The title of your book is The Labor of Enjoyment Towards a Critique of Libidinal Economy. So my second question is that along people like Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari's, or along their anti-Oedipus, libidinal economy has been seen as a post-May 68 statement. Lyotard distanced himself from conventional critical theory and Marxism because he felt that it had a rigid structuralist approach. And he moved, of course, to attempts in psychoanalysis, semiotics, economical history, and erotica, and so on and so forth. So to what extent do you think such a concept, libidinal economy, which was immersed in the post-68 context, is still required and functions?
Well, but this is something that the notion itself maybe became popularized in the around 68 and post 68, not only through Lyotard and Deleuze and Guattari, but also through, but this is already before, this is already in the 50s, by figures like Herbert Marcuse. And indeed, Freud always spoke about the economic factor. So it's something that comes from Freud himself. It hasn't been really invented in the 50s or 60s, if you want. So Freud explicitly talks about the organization of libido, of this, energy that is both symbolic and corporeal, and is, again, addressing this issue of objective fictions. He doesn't necessarily use the term Libidinal Economy, but he does speak of trip economy, so drive economy. So for him, I mean, we can take this term and extend it onto the Marxian context, because Marx as well recognized in the capitalist organization of production a drive-like dynamics. He explicitly speaks about capital as a drive-like dynamic. So, I mean, I see this as more than lucky coincidence, because for Marx, value is also very symbolic and very material as well. It's also an objective fiction which has its mobilizing power in the living bodies, and of course is being extracted from these bodies in terms of labor time and so on and so forth. So so the economic sphere here, I think, functions in exactly the same manner, or is pinpointing exactly the same issue in Marx and in Freud. So I would say, the term libidinal economy is not necessarily something outdated. But yes, I agree with you. I mean, there was a peak of the usage of this term in the 70s, and well, as good as I do, that one should never trust fashionable theories, or when theories become fashionable, one has reason to be suspicious. And if we look at what theories are being fashionable today, it's a bit they appear to me, and not only to me, quite problematic, sloppy, and superficial. If we look at, for instance, all these new materialisms, accelerationism, and so on and so forth. And I would say that when the term libidinal economy had its most prominent public moment and commercial success, if I may use the term, this was also the sloppiest way of using it. I personally think Lyotard's Libidinal Economy is quite a sloppy book. And Deleuze and Guattari themselves, or at least Deleuze, distanced themselves from the anti-Oedipus enthusiasm, so they sort of recognize also that there has been maybe a flaw in the book itself and in the enthusiasm that this book communicated, because it was written so immediately after May 68, and as a sort of fidelity to it, even though May 68 was an utter failure, an utter political failure.
Yeah, but well, absolutely. But I mean, yet for a lot of revolutionaries, this enthusiasm, not only back then, even in Arab Spring or other countries, including Iran, was a kind of hope for revolution, like this enthusiasm. You make a distinction between them.
Between what?
Between this enthusiasm that you're talking about, and that passion that might result in a revolution.
Well, I think, there is, of course, this huge tradition in also political philosophy to put the accent on enthusiasm as the affect that signals revolutionary developments in society, or that is the affect of revolution. Others, I mean, this goes back to Kant and his, second part of the faculty of the conflict of faculties writing. Others would say love, as a sort of, bond, between different subjectivities. Revolutionary, love as a revolutionary affect. I personally would say that perhaps a less spectacular and from my taste also more interesting and more required affect is solidarity. Because solidarity is not only a posture or an attitude towards another subject or another political movement and so on. I think it's fundamentally the name of an affect, of an affective state, which also requires certain effort, work, in order to be sustained, and which has a different way of dealing with difference than, the affect that we are all also very familiar with from critical theory and from Nietzsche in particular, which is the affect of relations of competition in capitalist universe, and that is resentment, which is also, or ressentiment, which is also having its comeback, in contemporary critical theory ever since the rise of Trump or the proliferation of populism or right-wing populisms. So yeah, I don't know. I think yeah, in the field of critical theory, there is also something like the choice of affect, and my pick would be solidarity.
Right. Yeah. Interesting differentiation between solidarity and love, actually, as you said.
Yeah, because sorry to interrupt. Maybe love. As Lacan says in Encore, love demands more. Love has this this ambivalence, that it can tip very quickly into hate also, or it stands in continuum, in a nexus with self-love as well. This was Freud's main point. I mean, every love is ultimately self-love, ultimately narcissistic. Lacan was not so pessimistic. For him, love was a disruption, a discontinuity in the subject itself. And I agree with this. I'm not really very, how to put it, fascinated by Freud's pessimism in matters of love. But I think there is a much more interesting alienation taking place on the level of solidarity than on the level of love. Even though I would perhaps even, when Freud says that Eros is the force that creates bonds, I would maybe even go as far as to translate in terms of interpret Freud's Eros with solidarity rather than love.
Yeah, but I see on the other hand, like people like Judith Butler, differentiation, like different interpretation of this ambivalence is also interesting in her recent book, Nonviolence. She talks about this kind of ambivalence in a kind of, she sort of appreciates this ambivalence that can emerge out of this mania that you have in Freud, and that can be a sort of a capital in a sense of opening of new multiplicities and new possibilities in our world. But here there is a point that I was just asking. It's a very general question, that is, hasn't the history of philosophy visited itself since early Greek philosophy with the question of enjoyment? And if so, what is the new thing that psychoanalysis is still going to offer Sorry, a general question.
Well, but you know, I mean, we can actually stick to Judith Butler's text because it kind of touches precisely upon what is novel in Freud's critical notion of pleasure, and that is precise this ambivalence, or you know that what he calls lust, you know, is actually in a constant state of tipping point. You know, it can go both ways.
Yeah.
It can be pleasure that is experienced in a pleasurable way, or in a non-pleasurable way. So it's a sort of border phenomenon. I mean, one issue that needs to be addressed, in my opinion, constantly when we talk about pleasure, enjoyment, or whatever, you know, that this confusion, this mess that results from the translation of lust into English and other languages. And now I don't know about Iranian, but if we look at French or English, they differentiate something that lust still, you know, allows to unite. Because if it would be pleasure or plaisir, if it would be really something pleasurable in the everyday sense of the term, then Freud would probably use Vergnügen. Lust, and the English has the best possible translation, lust, the deadly sin, you know, has this compulsive, involuntary, imposing nature, connotation, you know, in the very term, built in the very term, the dimension of danger, the dimension of, unpleasurable. And also this dimension that Freud constantly points out, that something enjoys in the subject, that the subject vanishes on the level of enjoyment, so to speak, or is dissolved. Yes, I guess this was a major discontinuity that Freud introduced into the history of pleasure. And that is precisely tied to this German term Lust, which is which insists on the ambiguity of pleasure, or ambivalence. That ambivalence is the key feature of the life of drives, that's also something that Judith Butler in the essay on aggressivity, precisely, you know, very strongly accentuates, like you said. And the interesting part, of course, is here precisely this issue of aggressivity on the level of the drive,
right,
and on the level of enjoyment or pleasure, whatever term we want to use. This is, I think, the main problem of Freud's mature theory of pleasure and of the drive. That there is this constant threat, constant danger on the horizon, that the drive will become the drive of destruction, Destruktionstrieb, you know, which is basically, or the death drive. I mean, he has different names depending on the directedness of the drive. If it's directed inwards, it's the death drive. If it's directed outwards, it's the drive of aggressiveness, or destructiveness.
There is I have a quote from you: psychoanalysis brings the dependency of enjoyment on language to the core. I quote you: according to Freud, repression is the foundation of politics and, more broadly speaking, culture in general. Repression is probably one of the most misunderstood Freudian concepts because it immediately evokes images and scenarios of oppression and struggle. End of quote. What is this distinction that you make between repression and oppression, which sounds to be very vital?
Yes, I mean, this is also somehow connected to a fundamental translation issue, and it's interesting. You know, there's this wordplay that Freud also quotes in his book on jokes, Italian wordplay, traduttore, traditore, translator, traitor. You know, one treachery has been made when Verdrängung has been translated as repression. I mean, into French, répression. No? And Foucault was, you know, very much making the point that there is this oppressive dimension that Freud is assuming in the sexual life, and that sexuality is some sort of vital substance that is being oppressed or in the state of repression, which means exactly the same as in the state of oppression. And this is also something that Marcuse, you know, picked upon already before Foucault, except that Marcuse was actually embracing this thesis. Foucault was criticizing it. Foucault was like, you know, if we look at the nature of sexuality and how it has been produced as an epistemic object and how desires are being generated, there is nothing oppressive about it, you know. Already, you know, this idea of polymorph perversion that Freud, you know, with pinpoints in the field of human sexuality, at least, goes in the direction of non-oppression, that there is, you know, a certain proliferation of sexuality rather than oppression. But this is precisely the point of his notion of Verdrängung, that the goal of sexual activity, or of the force that strives for sexual satisfaction, the drive, is displaced. That the point of the drive is not to reach an ultimate or circular or, you know, temporary satisfaction, but to kind of combine satisfaction and dissatisfaction. So when Freud says that the drive is cut off from its object of satisfaction, this means precisely that it doesn't have immediate satisfaction, or that its immediacy is always already mediation. So that's Verdrängung, that's repression as something that precedes oppression, or that can precede oppression. And yeah, I mean, of course, Freud's point was also that there is a certain relation between this mechanism of repression and the strategies or the reality of social oppression. Of course, I mean, capitalism is a very oppressive mode of production or social order, but it is grounded on repression. It is grounded precisely on this impossibility to satisfy the capitalist drive of valorization or self-valorization of value. You know, this is again a point of intersection between the way Freud talks about the drive and the way Lacan, Marx talks about the drive.
Right.
So one could also say that Marx, in a way, encountered this dimension of repression, but didn't articulate it in a concept. He was more the theoretician of the consequences of repression, which are oppressive indeed.
Thank you. Already in the beginning of the book, Samo, you address identity politics quite tacitly, explicitly. Well, so I'm quoting you: identities are underpinned by the fantasy of an organically whole, fully constituted and stable subjectivity. One could also argue that contemporary identity politics ultimately comes down to identification with fantasy. Hence, from the viewpoint of the psychoanalytic theory of the subject, the personal is political should be supplemented with the clinical is political. I would be thankful if you could elaborate it.
Well, but I mean, like it stands, it's the talk is about contemporary identity politics, which is through and through liberalized and integrated in the workings of contemporary post-neoliberal capitalism, and as soon as we kind of try to fabricate a stable figure of subjectivity, this implies that we have to delimit it from other presumably equally stable figures, which, given that we live in a symbolic or in a political universe which is dynamized by and through relations of competition, always appear or function in relation to our identity as a threat, or generate resentment, or are kind of perpetuating relations of competition in the political sphere. So that's why contemporary identity politics is, for me, basically a disarming of emancipatory struggles and their subjugation or subordination under the imperative of political competitiveness. And the talk about identity implies also the externalization of difference. Again, that's why I think the psychoanalytic theory of the subject, which is very negativistic, in a way, is the perfect negation of this liberal appropriation of the notion of identity, because it includes difference as if we talk about identity from the viewpoint of psychoanalysis, which of course we can, we have to talk about gradual or processual identities, which means identities that contain difference, as Hegel would say, or metamorphic identities that transform or expand through time. Or identities that are in themselves already containing multiplicity. So yeah, in this respect, I'm opposed to identity politics. Historically, what the term signified for emancipatory struggles, comes much closer to what psychoanalysis understands under political subjectivity than what liberalism, with its appropriation of identity politics, then deduces from it, because it merely applies, this sort of model subjectivity that is, that has been labeled possessive individualism onto the notion of a minoritarian identity formation. and embeds it. By doing so, it embeds it into this competitive universe in which there is no solidarity, of course, then possible.
So then the opposite, actually the opposite of this capitalist competitiveness for you is actually solidarity again.
Yes, I mean competitiveness and the affect of resentment or envy or greed, whatever goes along with. I mean, and there is a multiplicity of affects that are compatible with competitiveness, whereas solidarity contains a certain deadlock.
You have also written about ressentiment, I think, yeah.
Well, I mean, it's a topic that preoccupies me. Yeah.
I would be interesting to read your take on ressentiment, because I mean, of course, there are different I mean, I'm not that much familiar to that, but of course, Nietzsche, Max Scheler, but also Sloterdijk, they are the figures that spring to my mind. I would be happy to hear what exactly your take to ressentiment or your move to ressentiment means.
Well, but I mean, Max Scheler is here really an interesting figure because he was precisely the one who associated the increase of ressentiment in capitalist societies with the expansion of economic liberalism into all spheres of social and subjective life. The increase in economic, social, and other inequalities. So basically what ressentiment does is it toxifies difference. That's the main achievement of this affect. And that's why, I appreciate Scheler's hint, or well, not hint, I mean, he basically says it, that ressentiment is the affect of economic liberalism, which means that ressentiment is the capitalist systemic affect, in difference to what Nietzsche is claiming, that it's the affect of the Judeo-Christian religious or worldview tradition. But I mean, Nietzsche is producing myths, whereas Scheler really detects a real issue, a real structural issue in the capitalist modernity.
So now that we are, sorry to interrupt you, but
and takes also this point that Nietzsche is making, that there is an increase of ressentiment. I mean, Nietzsche didn't just, get everything wrong. It's just the wrong association of ressentiment that may be reproached to him.
Right. But now that we're talking about ressentiment, I mean, it's absolutely a spontaneous question. And given that you might be quite ambivalent to the projects of Deleuze and Guattari, or these readings of Lacan, or these approaches to Lacan, don't you think that at least Deleuze and Guattari's project was to a large extent, at least methodologically, fighting this ressentiment?
Absolutely, and I mean, I don't want to come over as a Lacanian dogmatic. I think I can do a lot with Deleuze and Guattari's critique of a certain, for instance, structuralism, also of a certain use of Lacanian theory and I mean, I never bought into this understanding or this presentation of Deleuze as this positive, vitalist thinker. He's a very sinister figure. I mean, one merely has to look at the animals that fascinated him. You know, I mean, he hated, for instance, dogs and cats, domestic animals. He was into ticks, into, you know, like beings of the surface, you know, spiders. You know, personally, I love cats and I have a major arachnophobia. So I don't really, I can't really follow Deleuze on that one. But I totally subscribe to his, you know, this privileging of surface and also privileging of becoming. But, you know, as Nietzsche, Deleuze's, you know, master figure already said, becoming is the greatest Hegelian invention. You know, this is where the persistence of the negative in Deleuze's thought can also be pinpointed. I mean, the very concept of becoming is a figure of negativity, I would say. And the way Deleuze uses it is actually, yeah, I mean, of course, open also in the direction of vitalist appropriation, but I think Deleuze is also having this feature of ambivalence that I very much appreciate in his work.
Thanks for the answer. I mean, I have this this question that somehow you talked about it, but it's a major part of the book you have devoted to these differences. The attempt in the book is a politics of working through Durcharbeiten, rather than politics of happiness, Aristotle, or narcissism, Adam Smith. Is it because in capitalism you believe that value and pleasure overlap entirely?
Well, I mean, you know, this was also Lacan's point that what happened in modernity is the quantification of enjoyment, that enjoyment became countable. And I think, I mean, when he, and by becoming countable, you know, it became value. And I mean, Lacan even translated the notion of exchange value, you know, from Marx or from the context of political economy with the term value of jouissance or value of enjoyment. So there is a very clear hint in his work that value and enjoyment overlap in modernity. And, you know, also this very idea that surplus value in Marx is homologous to Lustgewinn, or what he calls surplus enjoyment, like him being Lacan. This homologization also kind of suggests, you know, that we can interpret surplus value in Marx as a sort of systemic enjoyment of the capitalist system.
An absolutely spontaneous question is your thought, I mean, on the verge of this potential war that seems to be hopefully evading somehow, fainting somehow between Ukraine and Russia. How do you interpret this kind of enjoyment of war, or enjoyment inherent this kind of destruction?
I mean, well, you know, I mean, I think I very much, well, you're actually hitting one topic with this question that is increasingly preoccupying me, and that's precisely this issue of this issue of aggressiveness and the drive of destruction in Freud's work, which was, you know, I think what his theory of drives basically amounted in. And I mean, I would take, I guess, I mean, I think there are still 2 points from Freud's reflections on war, which are very contemporary, which haven't lost in significance and critical value. One is this lack of death on the level of the unconscious, that there is no signifier for death, or that there is no representation of death in our unconscious, that we do not believe in our own mortality. And the other one is this issue of aggressiveness, or aggressiveness as drive, aggressiveness as a feature of the drive being precisely an impersonal force, a non-psychological force, a force that pertains to the system itself, you know. So one could say perhaps that war is the exemplification of a dangerous tendency of the capitalist system, and that is that it is a system that on the one hand works against humanity, works against life, and that it is structurally a system that runs amok, you know, that is out for destruction. That is a completely antisocial system.
Samo, there is a part in the book that I really enjoyed. You talked about hypocrisy. And then what I liked is that hypocrisy in Freud's criticism, there are 2 hypocrisies, one in religion and the other in capitalism. Quoting you, in contrast, religion, capitalism is a different hypocrisy. While religion pretends to protect, capitalism finds to liberate. Just found it interesting. And if you have any energy left to elaborate the way that capitalism can function hypocratically.
Well, I mean, you know, the main hypocrisy here concerns the notion of freedom, and this is, I mean, this is something that that has become most evident, you know, precisely in the decades of neoliberalism, and you know, this kind of enforcement of the libertarian stance in economy, where the notion of unbound and antisocial freedom has been promoted. So the understanding of freedom, first and foremost, as freedom from constraints. That's why unbound freedom. You know, if we take, for instance, the 3 political universals of the French Revolution, we see that freedom has 2 constraints. One is equality, and the third, and the other is, well, fraternity. I would translate it as solidarity, precisely solidarity. So, but unconditioned solidarity. So not because, of course, formation of closed social groups requires solidarity. So I wouldn't fetishize, you know, this notion too much. But in this context of closed groups or group exclusivism, precisely the formation of fraternities, with all the connotation of masculinity that we can put onto it, requires also, you know, this exclusion of difference, which means also generation of a resentment. So there is also a certain compatibility between solidarity and resentment. But you know, I mean, in difference to this triplet of political universals, neoliberal capitalism really managed to, you know, dismantle this knot of political universalities and only enforce this idea of absolute freedom, which is above all, first and foremost, freedom of the market running amok, precisely, you know, And this reflects also a bit in the way, for instance, in everyday political reality, phenomena like freedom of speech or the idea of freedom of speech are being interpreted as the right, to speak racist. That's unbound freedom, where political speech equals verbal diarrhea, if I may say so, or organized, discursively organized aggressiveness and obscene enjoyment, misogyny, homophobia, and so on and so forth. So that's what the idea of freedom of speech has become, and it is modeled precisely on the idea of, the paradigm of absolute freedom being the deregulated and life hostile market.
Right.
Same aggressiveness on the level of the organization of the economic sphere or social economic sphere, and on the level of the libidinal economic sphere again, on the level of speech.
My last question is, if you can assume any future of psychoanalysis, to what extent do you think that the future of psychoanalysis depends on the future of capitalism?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's it's always it's been addressed over and over again. I mean, I guess the question can be supplemented or extended onto another question: what is the future of Marxism, or what is the future of the critique of critique of capitalism, or critical theory beyond capitalism? I mean, just because these orientations in thinking emerged in capitalism doesn't imply, at least for me, that they are finite, that they will end with capitalism. The problem is, how will capitalism end? I mean, will it end so that some life remains, or will it impose its own end as the end of the world and the end of life, which is what is happening at the moment. And that's why I spoke about capitalism as a system running amok, because we are all, some more, some less. Of course, there are more privileged part of the world than others, but I think we are all taken hostage by this system, which, of course, again, I wouldn't say we are all in the same boat, because some have spaceships and can very easily evacuate themselves. And yeah, there are no same boats. Or if there is a same boat, it has different class categories, which means, again, that the same boat has segregation being reproduced in the midst of the catastrophe. If there will be an afterlife, or if there will be life post-capitalism, I doubt that human subjectivity will be organized in a way that that would exclude analysis, I think. And also, I doubt that human relations or social bonds will be organized in a way that will make critique or critical thought obsolete. So I wouldn't call myself a political pessimist, but a certain realist.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, Samo. That was a nice, enlightening, and instructive talk to you.